So Jonathan Allday has worked as a teacher, subject head, faculty head and academic deputy at several boarding and day schools across the UK, and is mostly known for his work on the steering group of the HMCPD Academic Deputies National Conference, which he's also chaired twice. Jonathan has retired in June this year, but is still working as a consultant, using his wealth of experience to help schools with chem data, curriculum development, timetabling, and management. So I'll hand over to Jonathan shortly, but I just quickly need to start a poll so that we have a sense of where you all are in terms of agreeing and setting targets with students. So I'm going to start the poll now. And if you could all just drop your answers in, that would be great. So the poll is now open. And the question is, do you already engage your pupils in agreeing their target grades? Well, lots of responses coming in. Thank you very much. A strong yes there, I think, so far. So I will close the poll in a moment, and then Jonathan can use some of that information to inform the presentation that he's going to be giving.
Well, okay. If it's a strong yes, everybody, it's almost like it's not bothering.
Okay, it's a strong yes. Okay, so I'm going to close that now. So we've got a strong yes of 71%, 16% wow. No, and 12% would like to, but don't have the time. So Jonathan, I'm going to hand over to you to start your presentation, and then we'll come back to questions at the end if there's any that we can't pick up during the course of the presentation.
But hello, welcome. I'm talking to you from a reasonably sunny branch of Yorkshire, just at the minute, just gone mid-afternoon in the UK. And what I want to talk about today is this whole idea of predictive data and how it can be, well, based on experience of doing this in a variety of schools, talking to a variety of schools about it, and sort of trying to pull together some threads of what I've learned in the process. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that the ideas I have are unique, nor that they're definitively correct. It's just based on my experience, this is what I think we should be aspiring to. There are various things that get in the way of achieving this quickly in a whole variety of different schools, what you might call local difficulties or local reasons. And I'm not saying for 1 minute that in any school that I've worked at, we've managed to achieve a perfect system whereby what I'm going to talk about was actually in practice and completely worked right throughout. It didn't. But I believe you have to have something aspirational, that word will come up a lot, in mind, both from the point of view of the pupils, the teachers, also from the point of view of the system. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. As I said, not trying to make any definitive claims that this is how you must do it, but to start discussions, which in the end, I think is what data is really all about. Anyway, most importantly, I'm going to switch off my webcam. We're going to move across and actually have a look at these slides and start the presentation itself. So, to summarize, the basic approach that I've got in mind is, I hope we can all agree that there is at least good evidence to suggest that if you use baseline data, and some of you out there, I'm conscious, may not be regular chem users or may not even have used chem data at all up to now. So I will say a little bit more about what I mean by baseline data, but I'm hoping a lot of you will have chem data, at least to some extent, or even possibly, dare I say it, data other than chem, already to some extent embedded in your schools. But if we can use baseline data to set some realistic challenge grade, for want of a better phrase, for our pupils, and if that is followed and supplemented by some process which effectively from a point of view of result, but also from a point of view of time, allows us to track a pupil's progress, and that if the correct teacher interventions are in place, and if there is some level of focus on exam requirements, and if we can reinforce what's required in a grade descriptor, you might say, or a mark scheme, if all of this sort of thing comes together alongside, obviously, most importantly, good practice in terms of teaching and learning in the classroom, I'm sort of taking that for granted in everything I say. This won't work without, good practice in teaching and learning, nor am I suggesting for 1 minute this in any way replaces teaching and learning. It doesn't, of course it does. It just provides an additional context, an additional framework in which that teaching and learning can blossom. If we have all of these things in place, that it will actually help raise pupil attainment. For a variety of reasons, I believe, not the least of which is it can actually raise aspirations. There's that word again. It can raise aspirations both in terms of the pupils' aspirations for themselves, what they are capable of, a realization of what they are capable of, or alternatively, a bit of a warning bell. If you don't watch it, then your ability may not come through in the actual examination itself. You may underachieve. But also as well, a teacher's expectations. Sometimes we get impressions of our pupils. Sometimes we get surprised when we see the baseline data that they're actually more able than we possibly thought that they were. So we're raising aspirations both from the point of view of the pupils themselves, but also sometimes from the point of view of teachers of their pupils. But if all of this sort of thing is in place, then I do believe we can say that it will help raise pupil attainment. But the big question, and the question I want to focus on to some major degree during the course of this morning, is how do we actually derive that grade? Yes, we want some sort of a grade by which the pupil's aspirations are pegged, or to which the pupil's aspirations are pegged. We want some sort of a grade by which their progress is monitored, against which their progress is judged. We want some sort of a grade to be able to frame a context of conversation. If you're going to achieve that grade 7, then you need to improve your ability to write in sentences, to calculate, to do whatever the subject requires. But where are we going to derive that grade that frames the conversation from? Over the course of a few years, I have developed what I think is a reasonable form of words. I share it with you in case you think it's of use to you. I'm sure in many schools you'll have your own way of approaching this. But I think the most important thing to stress when you're talking to colleagues about this is that in the end, this baseline grade, this target grade, this challenge grade, whatever you want to call it, has to be the teacher's best professional judgment of that student's ultimate potential. The teacher's best professional judgment. Based on, at least that judgment needs to be realistic but ambitious. It needs to show, or needs to enable some degree of stretch for that pupil. They're not going to get this casually. They're not going to get this without some degree of putting their back into it, shall we say. So it is the teacher's best professional judgment. And because of that, it will be informed by a variety of instruments. Students' performance in class, their performance on preps or tests or progress tests as they make their way through the course. It's also going to be based on the teacher's experience. By and large, teachers have seen whole realms of different pupils and pupils of similar standing, similar ability in their classes. So you get a sense of where this pupil is at. Sometimes that sense can be wrong, and it does need baseline data to shake it up a little bit. But all of these things will go into what we back. And I think it's very important that as senior leaders, some of us have been senior leaders, some listening out there may be senior leaders. I think it's very important that we emphasize always that we back the teacher's best professional judgment over anything that data says. Reserve the right to disagree and question, but nevertheless, we need to be clear that we are backing the teacher's judgment. So all of these things, but as well, the MIGIS or ALICE data, whichever it is you're using, whichever it is appropriate for that particular year group, that will go into the mix as well, as part of what informs that best professional judgment. And where I want to be slightly more controversial, possibly not with 71% in the poll, is to suggest that this also needs to be, to some degree at least, by conversation with the pupil. And we must leave open the possibility that this grade is going to be revised at key points. This needs to be judged carefully, because there's no point having a moving goalpost. The pupil needs to settle in to some notion of what their challenge grade is and develop towards it. There's no point if every half term we are changing that grade, but we do need to suggest that there are waypoints, marker points at which it is sensible to revise that grade, possibly up, possibly down. Mock examinations would be one obvious key point or marker point, but sometimes a mock examination is not that far away from the actual examination. So if you're revising challenge grades at that stage, arguably it's a little bit late in the course. But if you're talking about GCSE, then the end of year 10 perhaps, the schools will know their local rhythm at which these things are best done. But I would like to suggest further that the pupils need to, in some sense, buy into the grade. It's not like they walk into their class and you get some sort of rubber stamp and you go, bang, grade 7 on their forehead. Oh, I'm a grade 7. I've no idea why I was a grade 7 or what grade 7 actually means, but apparently teacher thinks I'm a grade 7. They need to understand where that has come from, what it means in terms of ultimate performance in examinations, what is expected to be able to achieve that grade, and they must buy into it. Otherwise, it is just literally something you've stamped on their forehead, which they have no particular vested interest in, they've no particular belief in, and no particular aspiration to climb towards. And we must, as I've already said, monitor their progress and review that grade with them. How are you getting on towards this? You need to work a little bit harder in this area. You're doing extremely well in that area. 71% of you out there are doing this already, so I'm sure you have an idea of what I'm talking about. Now, based on what I've seen at my own school and also in conversations and doing training from time to time for other schools, I think there is a tendency, particularly if MIGIS or baseline data has been present and used in the school for some while. In my own particular case, when I joined the school I recently retired from, they've been using the chem data since the late 1970s, off and on. And I think sometimes for historical reasons, then there is a particular focus on the grade prediction. You know, you do your baseline test, you get your baseline score, and comes with that a prediction about what that particular pupil should get at GCSE or A level, depending on the other stage of the examination. And there is a focus on that prediction because, after all, it is a single simple grade. Yes, it's a 7 or a 6 or a 5 or an A star, a single simple grade that is identified and placed in some spreadsheet somewhere next to that particular pupil. Often these are issued centrally. If any of you out there have been or aspire to be academic deputies, stroke director of studies, you know that we love our spreadsheets. And there's a great temptation to send out the latest spreadsheet with all the predictions to do with particular pupils per subject out to all of our colleagues. And then we can sit back as a director of studies, academic deputy, whatever, and bask in a job well done. We have got grading and monitoring and progress done well in our school. Possibly not. But yes, we do issue this single grade. We do acknowledge that sometimes the grade needs revision, but we're still focusing on that single grade that comes out. And I think in many cases, there is a certain implicit, or in some cases, very explicit, slight fear of this grade, because it is this grade against which the impression is sometimes created that the teachers teaching will be judged against that grade. If the pupil doesn't achieve this predicted grade, wherever it's come from, then that is a question of value added. And if you're not achieving your good value added in the classroom, then something's wrong with your teaching. That's an impression I've done my level best in any school I've been involved in senior leadership to fight strenuously against. And this is another reason why I think the single simple predictive grade, if we can blur it, lose it, strike it out from our processes in schools, then we are better to try and do so. Because I would rather say to a teacher, you know, I would like you to be ambitious in what challenge grade you set your pupil, and I'm not going to judge you badly if they don't achieve that. I reserve the right, of course, in a situation where a variety of evidence perhaps comes together to say something is possibly not working right in your classroom, then we can have a conversation about it. But that would be something I need to gather from a variety, as I said, different evidences, not just simply that some of your pupils have failed to reach their challenge grade, because that is just going to happen. Of course it's going to happen, but we must rejoice in those that do achieve that grade and those teachers that do take the risk of stretching their pupils. And I think we can do that if we move the focus away, or at least move in that direction of moving the focus away from this single grade, which can have negative connotations and can inhibit teachers from being slightly more ambitious in their aspirational grades. It's also, we need to sort of look at it from the point of view of the pupil. Where has this grade come from? Those statistical geniuses at Chem, you know, from the pupil's perspective, they have sat down and done a test at some point, and a number has come back which says this is what you're going to achieve at GCSE. That's an obscure process, to say the least. And we need to engage the pupil with what's actually going on here, rather than, as I've reiterated before, simply stamp their foreheads with a particular grade. We need something that is relatable in this for the pupils themselves. In order, it generates some sort of meaning for them. Where is it coming from? What is it telling me? How has it been derived? Otherwise, just like the case can be with the teachers, it becomes for the pupils just something else upon which they are judged. So what I'm suggesting is just simply using this raw prediction that comes back from the baseline data. It is a flawed process, partly because the process is flawed in my view, but also because the actual prediction itself is a flawed concept. It's not a prediction, it's more like a projection. And sometimes that projection is in itself not ambitious enough. It is a statistical, it is derived statistically in a way we'll discuss in a moment. And we also have this, as I said, this notion of teachers protecting themselves from performance judgment. And there can be genuine reasons why the data doesn't particularly apply to this individual pupil. What I'm arguing from a variety of different directions is that we need something more nuanced than just simply this raw predicted grade. That exists, and it is what is known as the chances graphs. And here are some examples of chances graphs for the same student at GCSE level here. What we've got here, I will argue, is much, much more informative than the single grade per subject that also would pop out of a spreadsheet alongside these chances graphs for this particular individual. The chances graphs, like any data, they have to be handled carefully. And one of the most important ways in which they have to be handled carefully is to absolutely emphasize that this is not chance. This is a, let's be blunt about it, a terrible, terrible name to call these things. I've got to say, I know there's people listening in here, but I've got to say I've had conversations with various representatives at Chem at various stages, and I'm still trying to persuade people that this is an awful name for what these are. It gives you the idea that you walk into the examination, you toss your coin, and there's some chance you're going to get this if you're lucky today. That's absolutely not what this is. We need to find some better name for it. Potential performance indicator is one that I've come up with, but I'm sure there are more imaginative people than me out there that can think of something better, just not chances graph. Okay, well, it's high time we sort of rehearsed what's actually going on here and switched to discussing a bit more about the actual data itself and how a chances graph, how a prediction, what this baseline score is all about. So we're going to be looking at what's effectively the basic premise behind the chem data. Now, as I'm sure you know, the fundamental idea is at some point in their career, it's certainly been suggested to me in the past that we should get our students to do their baseline test just after the school cross country or something like that, so they underachieve on the baseline test, so that our value added as a school looks better. Well, that's, you know, we're all professionals here. That's a particularly ridiculous thing to suggest. It's obviously suggested in jest, but there's a little bit of something behind it. Again, this fear of the value added, this fear of judgment against value added, that some of these slightly humorous, slightly facetious suggestions may mask something psychological underneath it. But anyway, we know the student goes in and sits this adaptive test and they get this baseline score, which is, you know, measured against verbal reasoning, vocabulary, maths, etc. But a single combined score is made out of them. And the pupil is put in a rank, as it were, from low, average to high across the country against that baseline score. The process is then effectively that you sit back and you wait for what grades these pupils actually do achieve when it comes to GCSE, for sake of argument, a little later in their career. So what this chart is supposed to indicate is that we've got baseline scores across the horizontal, and across the vertical we've got pupils that achieved various grades. It comes in stripes with gaps between them, of course, because the grade is a discrete value. It's either an A star or an A or a 9 or a 7, etc. So therefore it comes in stripes. Whereas the baseline score can be any number between typically 90, high 90s through to perhaps 130, 140. So we get this striping effect. Most of the data lies within a particular region, which I sort of emphasize with that shaded oval there. But one idea that's going to be useful for you to grab onto at this point, because I'll come back to it later, is if we're really going to represent this chart properly, it ought to be, in a sense, 3D. There ought to be height to it. That, in a sense, where I've drawn those stripes made up of individual stars to represent single pupils who achieve that score and that grade, actually, we should be stacking it up so it comes out of the page vertically towards us, because there are going to be thousands of pupils in this chart. And we either represented it by having loads and loads of stars clustered together to say there's lots of pupils who got this grade, who got pretty much that score, or we stack it up vertically. So I want you to get the idea that these stripes are actually like Lego blocks coming up out of the page towards us. We'll come back to that later on. So once we have this data, what the statistical geniuses at Chem do is they then produce what's called a regression line. If you like, a best fit, a line that best represents that data. What that means then is our particular individual with their particular score intersects that chart in possibly one of 3 regions. They might get one of the grades highlighted in red like that. Well, this is very figurative. Let's look at some actual real data. This is for a GCSE music examination. This is real data. I've actually, clearly the actual specific numbers, values aren't in there, but the actual chart itself is derived from real data. You'll notice that the trend line has a slight curve to it at the top end. That's because the most convenient data to hand for me, I'm afraid, was independent data, independent school data, and that does have that curvy linear fit to it. So that's music. In the same year, there's mathematics, GCSE mathematics, and you can see the spread of data around the line is slightly different. This is what we call about how tight the scatter is. If you look at this graph again on the top left here, there's a scatter of points there, and there's basically no correlation between the horizontal and the vertical. We would say that's correlation 0. If you look at the right-hand top graph, then you can see there is some arrangement. There's clearly something going on. There's some relationship between the vertical and the horizontal. There's still a fair bit of scatter. That correlation is about 0.7. And you can see in the little graphic at the bottom what a correlation 1, a 0.8, a 0.4 would look like. So in an individual year, exam year, each subject would have some range of scatter. So their data would correlate with the trend line to some greater or lesser extent. And it's important to be clear with our staff, our teachers, our colleagues, that we're not saying that the data is necessarily always perfect for every subject. You know, some subjects the correlation will not be as good, and some subjects the correlation will be tighter. We tend to try and get round that to make a fairer comparison between different subjects, because Chem derives what's called the standardized residuals. If you look at the Chem data, then you can see the standardized residuals where the scatter around the regression line is evened out to be the same for all subjects. This does have a slight disadvantage in that the regression, as it were, the residual, I should have said rather, the difference between the grade that's predicted and the grade that is actually scored by the pupil, you can't read that from a standardized graph because the standardization breaks the link between an actual grade and how far away from the regression line it is. If you're about 1 unit of standard residual away from the regression line, that corresponds to something like 0.8 or 1.2 grades, depending on the subject. But if we go back to a sort of standard, sorry, I beg your pardon, an ordinary graph, which is not showing standardized residuals, then you can see we've got it here. We've got our trend line, we've got our shaded oval showing where most of the data lies, and we've got our baseline score against the GCSE result, a reasonable correlation of 0.75. Our individual student would then have a particular baseline score. Where that baseline score intercepts the trend line, you will come out with the actual prediction. As you can see from this case, we're saying here that that student should have a grade somewhere between 6 and 7. That's what our prediction for that grade would be. Now, obviously, the grade can't be somewhere between 6 and 7. If they score a 7, then their residual is positive. Let's say that graph said it was 6.5. They would get a positive residual of 0.5. If they got a 6, they would get a negative residual of 0.5. That's the prediction. That's where the prediction comes from. What about the chances graph? Well, the way I want you to think of the chances graph is to remember what I said before about these charts really having a vertical perspective to them, so that these stars that are lying along here, actually they should be coming up out of the page towards us. And so if I draw a line through that at the particular score that pupil had, then what I'm doing is I'm taking a vertical slice through that distribution at that particular score. And it might look something like that, viewing it from the side on. If I took that slice, took it out and rotated it slightly, and then it turns into a chances graph. Ugh, I hate that phrase. It turns into a predictive indicator or something that looks a little bit like that. And what this is saying to us is that in that year, all the pupils who had a mid-year score of 118, which puts them in band A, of those pupils on that particular GCSE, happens to be GCSE chemistry, then we can see that 26% of them got a 9. Having said that, of course, 74% of them didn't. And if we were to discuss this with the pupil, if we were to sort of sit down with them with this chances graph in front of us and say to them, look, this is what happened. Why do you think there's a difference between those that got the 9 and those that didn't? And their first comment might be, oh, well, the people that got the 9 are the clever ones. No, these are all the pupils, the only candidates that went into this chart are ones that all got the same baseline score, 118. So on that measure, they're all equal ability. And oh, by the way, on that measure, they're all equal ability to you, the particular student in front of us. What does this chart tells us? It tells us, look, all grades are possible, positive, encouraging voice. It also tells us, look out, all grades are possible, warning voice. Yes, you might be able, but just being able doesn't mean you're necessarily going to walk out with the 8 or the 7 or the 9, because actually some equally able pupils got a 5, a 4, and a 3. Watch out. Or, as I said, positive voice, hey, look, you know, your ability shows that you've actually got a, what would it be, 47% chance of getting a 9 or an 8. Did you know you were that good? Did you think you were that good? Should we aim to get you into that bracket? Here's the same pupil, different subject, and you can see because of their baseline score of abilities, then they possibly aren't quite as good at doing English as they were at doing chemistry. This could possibly be me. You know, my skills lied in the mathematical sciences side. I wasn't quite so good when it came to the languages area. So there's something that's of interest to discuss with the particular pupil. But let's come back to the difference between the prediction again. I've switched to using A level here. Sorry about that switch, but it just means just the graphs are slightly more, again, slightly more convenient. So we're talking about a particular person here, and they've got a prediction from Alice, the A-level information system. They've got a prediction of a grade B in art and design. They've got a prediction of a C in drama. And if you look at those graphs in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen there, then the top row is GCSE art and design, sorry, is A-level art and design. The two graphs on the top row are A-level art and design. The one on the left-hand side is the chances, hate that word, chances graph derived from their GCSE score, which we acknowledge is the best statistical predictor of A-level performance. But on the right-hand side, left-hand side is GCSE score, right-hand side is the adaptive test. The red line is the prediction. Well, the lower row, by the way, same thing, is for drama and theatre. Well, what do we see here? We see a variety of things. Firstly, this is why the raw prediction is oversimplistic. We can see either side of that red line, there are good probabilities that the student can get grades either side of that raw prediction. Quite possibly the prediction for drama is quite reasonable, but if we look at art and design, is it ambitious enough? And if we were just focusing on those raw grades, we wouldn't see that detail. Wouldn't know. We'd be treating the art and design and the drama and theatre as just equally valid predictions. The chances graph exposes something more nuanced for us. But what else do we see here? And this is partly why I've chosen this example. Comparison between the left-hand charts and the right-hand ones. The left-hand ones derive from that student's average GCSE score, which, yes, repeat, is the best statistical predictor. The right-hand one done from the adaptive test. What am I seeing here? What are you seeing? Why is there a different profile? Is it possible that this student slightly underperformed at GCSE? Is this something to be discussing with the student at this appropriate time? Again, would we necessarily be seeing this via any other focus? So what I'm suggesting is when it comes to setting these challenge grades, we don't just use the raw prediction, nor do we do something simplistic like raw plus 0.6. We should be making reference to the predictive performance indicator. Yes, we're still talking about teachers' best professional judgment, but we're trying to provide them with the information to make that judgment in a nuanced way. We're discussing with our teachers and our HODs what these chances graphs are. We're discussing what they mean. We're discussing what we can say about the particular pupil in that context, and preferably we are to some level engaging the pupil with it and negotiating, for want of a better phrase, what the challenge grade will be with them. We do this via teachers, we do this potentially via tutor, head of year, whatever is available or whatever systems are in your particular school. Potentially, do we also do it via parents as well? And if we're going to be doing this, then we need to acknowledge that terminology matters. We need to be saying that it's a projection, not a prediction. Otherwise, parents and pupils think that they have been categorized, labeled, stamped, whatever. This is your grade. You have no chance of getting anything other than that. Of course, that is not the case. We need to think of a better phrase than just chances graph. And we need to come up with what we're locally going to call this grade. We went round this umpteen different times until we settled on challenge grade as being the terminology that we used. And I do think there is something of a role for a tutor, a mentor, a head of year, whatever. I know these are terribly busy people, as indeed teachers are as well. But the thing about someone in this overview position is they have the ability to collate information. They potentially can discuss Midgis and Alice information across a range of different subjects, not just the single subject that a teacher is going to be focused on. They can then stand back and look for some patterns. They may be in a situation where they can liaise with teachers and parents. You know, they can see that, as it would be in my case, here is a student strong in the mathematical sciences, their chances graphs look good in sciences, maths, etc. They clearly aren't quite the same mobility level in other areas. What can we do to support them and help them and engage with them on that? Potentially, when it comes to the right years, etc., perhaps there is a role for this in terms of advising on subject choice. We're certainly looking to be monitoring their performance across subjects, and this person is presumably part of their role, a central point of contact for pupils, staff and parents. As I've said already, we know that these are busy people, but we're talking here of a system which, if we are supporting them in devoting some time to this, will pay back in terms of time released later when it comes to having conversations with parents of a positive nature, possibly even of a negative nature. Here's my set of graphs again. Clearly, this is an extremely able student. The clusters are right up towards the top end of the grades here. And subject choice needs to be clearly, rightly, and mostly informed by where their interest lies, where their aptitudes lie, and with some eye to the future. What they want to do at A level, what do they want to do beyond that potentially? The subjects need to be focused in on this. But perhaps the graphs also have some level of role to play because, as I said, this pupil is talented, this particular instance, talented with lots of options, but perhaps some of the options are slightly better than others. So the conversation is certainly worth having, and this, I suggest, is simply one other factor that goes into the consideration over and above, over subject choice. If this is going to progress anywhere, then we need to pick these challenge grades up. In schools I've worked at, we've had a system whereby the challenge grade appears on assessments and reports. We developed an assessment and reporting system. I'm sure you've developed similar ones in your own schools, where we had the challenge grade, the attainment grade, where they actually were at that point in the course, and we came up with what was called a performance indicator, which was color-coded. So the idea is if you had a purple performance indicator, then based on your progress to date, if you continue to progress in a similar fashion, then that student would certainly achieve their challenge grade and perhaps better. If it was green, they were well on course to achieve their challenge grade. If it was amber, then chances are they would get their challenge grade, but there were things that needed to be done to make sure it was going to happen. Red, then serious intervention was needed here. A very good chance that that pupil wasn't going to achieve their challenge grade if they carried on in the way that they were. And expectations ought to be, if you think about it, the expectation ought to be that this performance indicator would most likely be amber for a period of time leading up to the examinations when you should expect it to go green. Arguably, if the performance indicator for that particular pupil in a particular grade and that particular subject is green from the off, then you've not set your challenge grade as being a stretch enough, or the teacher's being slightly too charitable, one of the two. It's okay, therefore, to be out every now and then, to be not achieving your challenge grade every now and then, as long as the gradient is up and towards that challenge grade. The expectation should be that it's amber, getting greener tinges to it as you get closer to the exam. It enables us to therefore set up interventions where that is not the case. So, where are we with a case of developing this in my particular schools, in my particular cases? Well, I've learned certainly that patience is a necessity in this. It certainly took me years to overcome inherent suspicion regarding the data. And I think that's something that we all from time to time face in our schools, where there are teachers who, for good reasons, are suspicious of the data. You know, one thinks of one's colleagues in art, in drama, for example. What can baseline test scores tell us about the pupil's creative ability? And that's a perfectly sound argument. It could tell you something about their ability to read and develop question answers, to sort of see the nuances in text, to proofread, but there are other aspects to those subjects over and above that. Yes, of course, we understand that. We're not suggesting that necessarily the data is giving us definitive information in those particular subjects, but it's starting conversations, and that's the most important thing. It's not a case that it doesn't work at all for a particular subject. We just need to take, again, I'll use the word, a more nuanced view about what the data is telling us. I also think, I've had this conversation with people from Chem as well, I also think there's a slight advantage to being slightly creative or slightly mysterious about the way in which the data actually works, because you're in danger of creating an impression amongst your colleagues. This is all about averages. You know, you're taking the average result of this, the average of that, you're doing a trend line, blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, this is all about averages, but there's no such thing as an average pupil, so therefore it doesn't work for any pupil. Well, that's a slightly fallacious argument, but it's nevertheless, I think, an impression that sometimes gets generated in people. Yes, our pupils are individuals. They have individual strengths, which are not necessarily utterly represented in the data, but the data allows us to have conversations about the pupil. And I know as a senior leader, I've had to battle against some suspicion of with regard to my motivation. What am I trying to do here? Am I trying to make judgments again on our teachers and our processes within the school? And it does take time, and it takes a single voice, and it takes commitment, and it takes, I think, sometimes a case of trust me and back me, and I will back you. That this is not what it's all about. My line is, if you get your baseline data testing right, if you get your teaching and learning right, if you get your monitoring, your challenge grade processes, all of that right, then the value added will take care of itself. Other concerns that rightly teachers have: no time in class. You're expecting me to take a class of 30 pupils and discuss their individual chances graphs with them. You're joking. What is it in the classroom that you don't want me to do if I'm going to try and squeeze this in? Yeah, of course. That is the single, I think, most pertinent problem with all of what I'm trying to suggest, and indeed the biggest obstacle I tried to overcome that prevented this idealized system that I'm putting in front of you from actually being developed.
Jonathan, could I quickly, sorry to jump in, I just thought we've got a question here from one of our delegates here. How do you judge whether a pupil is on target to their challenge grade based on their achievement, especially when you're a long way from the final exam, skills are underdeveloped, and how the red, orange and green tags could be judged early in a course?
That's an entirely fair point, and I'm going to give an answer, but I'm going to again say teachers' best professional judgment. based on their experience of how pupils progress. And I know there are complications involved with this. Let's take an example of mathematics, whereby certain skills need to be developed before they can actually achieve an overall grade across the entire subject. And early in the course, those skills won't necessarily be fully developed. And again, that's a question of communicating with teachers, communicating with parents, and communicating with the pupils. We would expect in the early stages of the course that our instrumentation, for want of a better phrase, isn't giving an exact, precise read, but it will get better as things develop, as the pupil develops, and as our understanding of where they are develops as well. But in the end, I think you back the teacher's best professional judgment on it. Yes, pupils at this stage, we would tend to say, yeah, that pupil is going to develop in such a way as they are likely to achieve their challenge grade or what have you. What we did, of course, do, which I've not really talked about, is that for what this performance indicator was, I've just simply given you the phrasing of the exact phrasing of the wording. There were descriptors behind that as well. And individual subjects, those descriptors were tailored to what you'd expect at a particular stage in particular subjects. So I've glossed over a certain degree of detail there. And I'm sure individual schools develop their own systems along those lines. But there's another thought I have about how you can do this as well, which I'd like to add in, if I may, once the presentation's over in the Q&A at the end. So perhaps if you could remind me to say a little bit about standardized testing towards the end, because I think that is also a contribution to this. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's grand, Jonathan. I'll try and remember that one to ask at the end.
Thank you. So coming back to this, no time in class, I think in the end, what I was saying to teachers was, I will back you. I think this is time well spent. I think if you take 1 or 2 lessons out from the course, obviously we don't want them sitting there twiddling their thumbs, set them from constructive work to be doing. Most of the time, the conversation with the pupil is actually very brief. What do you think about your challenge grade? Do you think it should be this? Yeah, that sounds about right for me. Great, next pupil. Sometimes the conversation needs to be a little bit more developed. Perhaps it could then move into a lunchtime or an after school or whenever else there is the time to pick up the more developed conversations. Pupils saying to you, for example, I've had this, I think the challenge grades need to be a little higher than that. I'm not convinced, actually. I think that might be a bit much of a stretch for you. I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to set it at this for the minute, and you need to convince me that you can do better. The minute you convince me, then I'll raise it by all means. How does that sound? Those sort of conversations possibly need to extend into lunches, breaks, what have you. But I've found that often it's a relatively quick conversation. But you've got to back the teacher. You've got to say, yes, release the time. Nothing would give me greater pleasure if I'm wandering around the school to pop into your class and see this conversation going on, because it will make conversations down the line easier. And if we can release some time, this is part of the bargain, if we can release some time by making our reporting system easier, we streamlined our reports along using these grades, made the less comments, fewer comments necessary, interim comments, end of term comments were needed, interim comments were. We streamline other aspects of it to buy back some time there. So we see it as a package. If we don't want this to be simply a bureaucratic exercise, then there has to be some buy-in, and that comes from the teacher, it comes from the pupil, and eventually perhaps it also comes from the parents. And ICT has to be up to the job. In my own particular historical case, trying to get our information systems up to the job was a big part of this. The ICT should be something that saves time, believe it or not actually takes more time than it ought to. When it comes
Jonathan,
to this data...
Sorry, I'm going to jump in. I know you asked me to do this when we spoke before the meeting. Yeah. If you want me to stop, let me know. But I've got a couple of points here. So we have, somebody's just asked, could you explain further the comment that there's no such thing as an average pupil?
That was a slightly facetious comment. What I meant by that was this, that I've had the argument presented to me by a colleague that says that effectively what they're saying is that because of the way in which this works, it relies on statistics, and that there's some level of averaging that goes on. You know, effectively we're averaging across all the grades and all the scores to generate the baseline data. But every pupil is unique. This was the head of English that was talking to me about this, in truth. Every pupil is unique. They have their own particular characteristics. You know, what is meant by an average pupil? There is no such thing as a defined statistical average pupil in a class. So if this statistics is only working for this sort of mythological average pupil, surely therefore it can't really work for any pupil. Effectively what they're saying is that the individual characteristics are so varied within a classroom that it's folly to try and average across them, to sort of say this pupil will achieve this. And I think this again is a reflection of overemphasis on the predicted grade rather than looking at the chances graphs. Oh, I used it again, didn't I? Rather than looking at those charts which show that for a particular measure, which is the baseline score, a range of outcomes are possible, one of which is the predicted grade, but others are available as well. And these take us outside of this sort of apparent reliance on just stamping out an average result, which on average our average pupils will get. That's what I meant by that, really. It's one of the data suspicions that I've come across in one of my colleagues on occasions, and I think I've seen it in other schools as well, talking to some of my colleagues. You've just got to keep plugging away at it.
I've got one more question here. Sorry, one more question. It's actually it's about the chances charts, which is why physics isn't included. And I think, Jonathan, the answer to that is that's just the screenshot you took of some of the subjects, wasn't it? Because physics would be included.
Yeah, absolutely, it would. My own data, which I've sort of, well, I've used in this presentation in the past, because obviously I've not been keeping pupils' data, just in case anyone is worried about that. Anonymized chances graphs that I've used in the past was all, I'm afraid, old-fashioned, not using the 9-to-1. So I simply made contact with some people in Chem and said, can you provide me the chances graph, just a range of subjects, and that's what they provided me with, and that's what I've used. Yeah.
That's brilliant, thank you. I'll stop interrupting for a moment, Jonathan, and let you carry on.
Physics would be up there. In fact, it would usually be in golden lights because it's my own particular subject, and so therefore dear to my heart. It's just was supposed to be indicative of a range, and I just took a subsample as my screenshot. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about overcoming our data suspicion. We've actually got a whole seminar on this coming up at some point next week. Well, I'll be talking, if I haven't bored you to death already, I'll be talking a little bit more about overcoming an element of data suspicion in schools. I think it is a case of plugging away, walking the walk in terms of your own commitment as a senior leader, to not judging too much in terms of value added, to backing teachers in the classroom, backing their best professional judgment, and using the predictive data in a more nuanced way with the graphs and the baseline scores to help inform our teaching and learning as part of what we do with our students. And it sometimes pays to bring an outside expert in. They may not say anything else other than what you've said, but it comes from someone outside, and it tends to be given a little more credence. We used to have somebody who came in once a year and trained all our new teachers in the use of baseline data. All new teachers were trained, all new heads of department were trained, slightly different emphasis, obviously, all new tutors. We had 2 or 3 days of training where, as I say, all these new stakeholders were trained in the use of baseline data and in the use of these predictive data graphs as well. And after a few years with a natural turnover in the school, we actually managed to swing to a point where virtually everyone bought in and understood what we were trying to achieve. You have to be consistent and realistic about what the data means, which is sometimes in a particular instance just an indicator. We're not trying to, again, I'll say it, stamp a pupil with a particular category that defines them in some average way. They have their strengths, their personalities, they have their aptitudes. We are just trying to generate conversations about them, with them. The role of dialogue is in fact crucially important. Data starts discussions. It can trigger debates about teaching and learning. It can put a new perspective on pupils. It can help when it comes to targeting our teaching and our tutoring. Your ICT, I think I'm going to be I'm running out of time slightly here. I think you need to be able to make sure this data can get to the teachers easily. They don't have to struggle to find it. We managed to get all our chances graphs on our management system as PDFs. We had a tracker that I built for all the baseline data the teachers could go on and address any set in the school and download the baseline data for one of their sets. There were some links in the management system to spreadsheets. Yes, I'm a director of studies. I love my spreadsheets. And progress trackers. I think this is where you need to buy time from your teachers, because there's nothing worse than condemning them to a bureaucratic exercise of periodically sticking grades in somewhere and then sticking them in reports and then sticking them in this. You need to have a streamlined system. I've seen some brilliant systems in schools whereby the teachers just need to make one entry and it propagates throughout the system in a convenient way. And then teachers can actually use them in a constructive way to see how well the students are progressing. He's doing okay in my subject. How's he doing in chemistry? How's he doing in maths? Oh, right, okay. Perhaps he's struggling similarly in similar areas. And embed it into your reporting system. I'm not sure there is anything fit for purpose out there off the shelf that you can buy. I'm talking to various people about it in terms of, that's my watch saying there isn't an answer for that either, which is, you know, good constructive intervention. I've spoken to a couple of companies about perhaps developing a progress tracker that can be bought off the shelf. A lot of schools I've seen have developed brilliant ones for themselves. It would be nice if there was something good out there that was flexible enough. So by the time I got to retirement, I was continuing to work with my heads of department in terms of developing this system, developing our challenge grade setting, developing pupil engagement. Some talk, as I mentioned, about standardized testing. What is the best way of doing that? Embedding it into our progress tracking. And I think we always need to continue to work on data validity, what data means, and that means also what it doesn't mean, what its limitations are, what we're not saying, as well as what we are saying. And that, I believe, is enough from me for the moment, for today. Thank you very much indeed. I hope some aspects of that have been useful to you. I'd like to re-emphasize again, I'm not saying that we got this in my schools perfect. I'm not saying that this is absolutely the only way of doing it, but I do feel that some engagement with these charts, these chances graphs, is a better way forward. And I would encourage you to explore ways in which this could be done in your schools if it is not being done already. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm just checking through the questions that we've got here. I think you've covered most of them actually during the course of the presentation as I was butting in with them. So unless there's anything that anybody else wants to add into the question box quickly now that we can cover. Otherwise, I've got a reminder here to everybody that's attended that you will get your certificate within an hour by email, and you'll also get the link to the webinar. So if any of you have missed any elements of this, or you want the slides, you can actually see the full webinar recorded. And also a call out, if there's anything that people would specifically like us to cover at Chem in terms of topics for webinars, do let us know. We'd be really keen to hear from you. But I can't see, lots of thank yous there, Jonathan, but I can't see any more questions coming through for you.
Well, let me just say very, very, very as briefly as I possibly can what I meant by standardized testing. If you do an examination, then you get a range of results, a range of percentages. Obviously, you do. If you were to put them in a chart, you get an average, a mean, and you get a spread. And so little Johnny gets 70% in chemistry. He gets 60% in English. But actually, if you looked at the data in more detail, you'd realize that the English exam was a good deal harder than the chemistry. So that 60% was actually a better mark in the English than the 70 was in the chemistry. How do you get around that? Well, I'm sure lots of people out there know and do this already. I developed a spreadsheet which made sure that every exam that was entered, I sent it out to all my heads of department. They just had to type in their results. I developed a spreadsheet that made every exam the same average and the same spread, so that 60% meant the same thing in each subject. Now, if it was a subject like one of the modern languages, regrettably, I hate this, but it's nevertheless a fact of life, they often have smaller class sizes, something like German, maybe a 10 or 15 or even smaller class size, then this process doesn't work quite so well. You have to bear that in mind. But it does mean that you can report a percentage or a grade or something that means the same thing in each subject. And I also believe, although this would take a little bit more explanation, there is a way of tying that into the baseline score. So that one of the things you can do is, this sounds a bit odd, but rather than getting the result back as a percentage, you can actually get it back as a baseline score. So rather than saying your grade, your percentage goes from 0 to 100 with an average of 50 and a spread of 10, you can say it goes from 0 to 140 with an average of 100 and a spread of whatever it is. And so then you get a score on the test back, which can be compared directly with what the pupil's baseline score was. I need to say a lot more about that to make it clearer, but that was one avenue that I was pursuing as a way of tracking a pupil's progress throughout the school. If people wanted to write to me to explain that in a little bit more detail, then I'd very happily put something down on paper to develop that thought a little more.
Jonathan, that might be really useful. I think we have somebody here that's actually asked about that, so we will connect you with them after the webinar so that they can follow that up with you.
Do that. Very happy to do that over the phone or by post or whatever.
That's great. Thank you very much. I can't see any more new questions coming through, Jonathan, so it just leaves me to thank you very much for another fantastic presentation, and we look forward to your next presentation. So thank you everybody for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again on another Chem webinar.